This is GARIS, Masculist, MGTOW flyers. That is 2-3 page essays on the themes of masculism and MGTOW. Written by and read aloud by Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. This is flyer number 409, part 2, entitled Masculism as Therapy for Monoconscious Feminists. Going straight on. Masculist theorists are saying that so many of the above problems that women face that are causing them to become unhappier are solvable if only women bother to become biconscious, that is, to learn some masculism, so that they lose their monoconscious feminazi anger at men, as explained above. The masculists are saying to women, and particularly to monoconscious feminists, that it is in their own self-interest to become biconscious. The rewards are then great, since they will stop being so feminazi bitchy, so misandrous, so accusatory of men, when in fact it is women who oppress men far worse, given women's financial parasitism of men, women's manslavery of men for decades, women's fluffy feminist hypocrisy in the divorce courts, women's many decades-lasting gender crimes against men, for example, paternity fraud, that is, in roughly 5% of pregnancies, the husband is not the father. Women's pill lying, so that men are forced to pay for kids they don't want in the first place, manslaving them for decades of their lives. In a few years, it's likely that most men will have been informed of the core masculist and MGTOW ideas, so that millions of women will be influenced by them too, especially once the journalists pick up on the idea that there's a second major gender political ideology out there which is having as much impact on men as feminism had on women. And that there are now a lot of very angry men who no longer tolerate being gender politically harangued by monoconscious feminists, when these men now know that women oppress men worse than vice versa. So when these men are verbally attacked by vindictive, misandrous feminazis in public, they attack these women right back, and with a vengeance, with masculist ideas, masculist rhetoric, scaring the shit out of these women, since they are accustomed to having had a monopoly over gender politics, so it comes as a real shock to be defeated at their own game, that is, seeing their traditional monopoly over gender politics taken over by smarter, more verbally aggressive masculist diatribers who blow these feminazi misandrists out of the room. Some years from now, there will be so many women who have become biconscious that they will start seeing monoconscious feminists as fools, as ignorami, to be pitied and combated. To biconscious feminists, it is an obvious point that biconscious feminists have happier lives, since they are much more likely to have a boyfriend, to be loved, to be sexed, and once enough biconscious women vote together with men for the men fairing of the gender laws, especially the men fairing of the divorce courts and the legislation of the para, etc., then they will also be more likely to have a baby, since once men are no longer prejudiced against in the divorce courts, once the divorce courts have been taken out of the control of the monoconscious feminazis, then men will be much more prepared to be fathers again, and more willing to give young women their sperm. These biconscious feminists, who initially will be smarter than the average monoconscious feminist, will play a growing role in a major split within the feminist movement, as biconscious feminists oppose the traditional doctrine of the monoconscious feminists in stating with the masculists that gender oppression is not a one-way street, that in fact women oppress men too, and in fact far worse, since women's oppression of men lasts decades. The biconscious feminists will be strongly influenced by the best of the masculist theorists and will become female masculists in part, together with their feminist views, not all of which are irrational, in brackets, unlike many of the traditional ideas of the feminists that make no scientific sense. For example, that women are just as capable as men, or that the patriarchy needs to be abolished, etc. Women are not as capable as men at the top end of the performance scale, since men are 4 IQ points smarter than women on average, have a 10% higher IQ variance, so it is to be expected that men have won 99% of the Science Nobel Prizes. Women have 10% smaller brains than men, so have 10% less neural processing capacity, so do not build anything, invent anything, create anything. Women are only tolerated by men due to women's two traditional monopolies of vagina and womb. But these two monopolies that women have always had are now being undermined by male engineering genius in the form of the sex bots and the art wombs. The sex bots, now on the market, have luscious curves, unlike the 40% of women who are obese and 30% fat. So 2/3 of women today are sexually repulsive enough to be unfuckable, close brackets, have film star faces, creamy, grippy vaginas, and are equipped with growing capacities to carry out conversations, thanks to AI, that are agreeable to men. Japanese scientists have grown a goat in an art womb, so human babies are not far off. When men can grow their own kids and prefer to sex their bots than fat, sexually repulsive, misandrist, monoconscious, feminazi females, then millions more men will soon be wiping their hands of women and living the MGTOW lifestyle, refusing to marry, rejecting paternity, spending their money on themselves, and basically giving women the finger. Smart biconscious feminists will see the writing on the wall far faster than average monoconscious feminists, so will be pushing the monoconscious feminists to reform their attitudes or continue to suffer by being made manless, sexless, loveless, babyless and pariahed by both sexes as more and more men go masculist and the smarter women go female masculist. The biconscious feminists will agree with the masculist theorists that the monoconscious feminists have become indirect genociders, especially in the divorce courts, since young men are now rejecting paternity at a rate of about 70%. Probably, if the gender laws are not soon men-feared, then within a decade, 90% of young men will be rejecting marriage and paternity, thus wiping out whole populations in even fewer generations. So the biconscious feminists will be joining forces with the masculists to men-fair the gender laws. When both masculists and female masculists push young women to become biconscious, many young women will have their heads turned. Women evolved to be herd animals. Look at women's fashion. Since those women who did not have a man to give her his male-hunted meat eons ago faced starvation, women evolved to help each other, to share their male-hunted meat, so a form of female collective evolved. Women are more likely to do something, think something, than are men if other women are telling them to do something, to think something. Advertisers take advantage of this female herd instinct in persuading women to buy the latest fashion, so that last year's fashionable clothes are no longer wearable, since the fashionable women are wearing this year's fashion, so that women who wear last year's fashion will be seen by the fashionable women as lacking female solidarity and hence more likely to be rejected. Women have a horror of rejection, since in the distant past, to be socially rejected meant an increased probability of death, so this fear was inherited. When men ignore women, especially monoconscious feminazis, these women go crazy, becoming very unhappy. Women have always been parasites of men, depending on men to defend them against other men, to provide meat for them, etc. A manless woman is usually desperately unhappy, despite what the monoconscious feminazis said about, quote, "A woman needs a man like a fish needs a bicycle." The reality is that millions of women are miserable today because they don't have a man in their lives who loves them, gives them orgasms and companionship. Much of the blame of this situation is due to monoconscious feminism, which teaches women that men are pigs. Men are gender oppressors, men are to be spat at, men are toxic, men are rapists, men are just plain shits. It's therefore not surprising that when men who are not pigs, not rapists, not gender oppressors, are non-toxic, etc., are totally put off by monoconscious feminazis who behave towards men as though men are pox-ridden. Masculists, and increasingly female masculists, can see that it is in women's self-interest to become biconscious so that they lose their toxic monoconscious feminazi views and instead have them balanced by a counter-gender politics that teaches both sexes that women oppress men more, since women's oppression of men is continuous and lasts decades. That fluffies have to fib up or be severely punished by men by being forced to rot on the shelf, as millions of monoconscious feminists are now doing. If women do not soon absorb masculist ideas, that is, become biconscious, then millions more women will be made increasingly unhappy, as millions more women are forced by men to rot on the shelf, left manless, loveless, sexless, babyless, and spat at. It is very much in women's self-interest, and in fact is therapeutic for women to become biconscious, since as a consequence they will lead much happier lives, fulfilling what their DNA tells them to do, that is to pair off with a loving, sexing male partner who wants to have kids too. But in today's gender political fuck-up, that is unlikely to happen. Before millions more women are forced by men to suffer a lot of pain, until women do fib up, become biconscious in their attitudes, and vote with men to amend fair the gender laws. In short, masculism needs to be seen by women as therapy for women, especially for monoconscious feminists who are suffering the most, since their monoconscious feminist ideas are poisoning their minds, making these women toxic for men, repulsive for men, who understandably want nothing to do with such women and wipe their hands of them. Cheers. Prof. Dr. Hugo de GARIS. Prof. Hugo de GARIS at yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. Author of the book Masculism, Men's Rebellion Against Being Man-Slaves to Women, an e-textbook of 400 plus masculist flyers for men's studies courses. Freely downloadable in Microsoft Word format from my website. Ciao.